Firstly, to identify an insect, we need to understand the anatomy, as identification keys explore specific parts of an insect's anatomy to help identify the species and also the sex of the fly or insect. In my pitfall and bottle traps last week, I unfortunately only managed to collect some flies, as some pesky little animal kept sneaking into my garden and eating the bait out of my pitfall trap, so I didn't get any kind of beetles or spiders, unfortunately. So let's look at the anatomy of flies, which are Diptera, true flies. So let's start with the anatomical terms. So we have anterior, which is the front, and posterior, which is the back. We have dorsal, which is from above, and ventral, which is from below, and we also have lateral, which is from the sides. And fly's body is broken down into three segments. We have their head, their thorax, and also their abdomen, and these themselves are broken down into different segments. As you can see here, several parts of the fly are labelled, and these are areas which are normally used to help identify what species of fly this is. So these are the areas which I'm going to use to help identify the flies that I have found. For the identification of the flies which I collected, I used the key for identification of European and Mediterranean blowflies, Diptera Calliphoridae, of forensic importance, as you can see here. Altogether, I collected 8 flies. I successfully managed to identify 4 of these. 1 was a partial identification and 3 I couldn't identify. So, for the first fly, we begin at the very beginning of the key and we look at the wing first, and we look at the stem vein in the wing. And I noticed that above this vein it was bare, so there were no hairs. We then observed the thorax and noticed it was non-metallic and dark in colour, and the lower calipers had hairs above them. This indicated that it was a Calliphoridae, which is a subfamily of Calliphoridae. This fly had 3 pairs of bristles running along the centre of the postsutural area of the thorax, and the abdomen kind of shined blue very weakly. This indicated that it was a Calliphora. The upper and lower calipers were mostly black in appearance, and the facial area of the fly, so like the facial ridges and the mouth area, and were orange in colour, and also the basicosta were yellow in appearance. These are just like the little bits where the wings attach. And this confirms that the fly was a Calliphora vicina. Whilst mainly the genitals of a fly are used to sex a fly, the eyes of the fly can also help in assisting determination of sex. So in this species, females' eyes are generally further apart on their head, whereas the males are closer together. So therefore, in this case, this fly was actually a female Calliphora vicina. Again, this varies between species and it may not always be correct, so that's why the genitals provide a more accurate analysis of whether it is male or female. The next 3 flies are all Calliphorian vicina again, and I'll work through the key with each one of them to ensure that I made an accurate and correct identification. So if we look at the first one, again the stem vein is bare above, the thorax isn't metallic and dark in colour, and the lower calipers had hairs above. They had the bristles going down the postsutural area of the thorax, and the abdomen was a little shiny in a blue colour. And the upper and lower calipers were mostly black, and the face region was all orange, and the basicosta was also yellow in appearance too. Again for the second fly too, as you can see here, and same for the third fly also in these pictures here. However, the third fly was a bit unusual really. I'm not sure whether this happened during collection or prior to collection, but if you notice here, the face of this fly is kind of concave, so it's going inwards rather than outwards like a normal fly's head, and the body was quite contorted. This made it a bit more difficult, albeit interesting, to try and identify what species this fly was, as some of the features were quite hidden, as I wanted to ensure that I didn't decapitate the fly in any way while I was making the identification. Now we move on to our 5th fly, and this was not a Calliphorian vicina. The stem vein above was bare, so there was no hairs. However, this time the thorax, rather than being non-metallic and dark, was bright green and metallic, and the lower calipers were bare above, and this indicated it was a Luciniae, which is another subfamily of Calliphoridae. Now this is where I say I only made a partial identification, as I can say for certain this fly is a Lucilia, but I can't say for definite what species it is. I'm only using a USB microscope to observe these flies under a microscope, as you can see in the pictures, rather than using, say, a light microscope in the labs at university. So it's quite difficult to determine some of the features and distinguish whether they are one thing or another. I believe this to either be a Lucilia seriata or a Lucilia silvarum, but I can't say for definite that it's either of these really without having proper identification, or maybe even asking somebody else to have a look for me. However, you can definitely see that it's not a Calliphoridae racina, as you can see the difference in the thorax colour and also the calipers also. So let's move on to our final three flies. I was unable to identify these as they are not Calliphoridae, so I cannot use this key to identify them, and I'm quite unsure on what the family of this fly is. It would be quite difficult really for me to try and find a key to help identify these, as there are thousands of species of flies in our world, so we'd have to make sure we know the family first to identify what species the fly is. But as they're not Calliphoridae, they are not a fly that is of forensic importance. If you have got some insects at home that you'd love to identify, that is fantastic. The internet is your best friend in helping you identify the insects you have found. Firstly, as I said, you need to find out what insects you do have. So do you have flies, or do you have beetles, or maybe even like caterpillars, or maybe moths and things like that. So you need to identify what insects you have first, and then you need to find out what kind of family of insects you have. Once you've found that, there are loads of keys on the internet for you to go through that will help you identify the insects you have, and you can find out what species of insects you have. So if you do have insects, I would love for you to show me what insects you have found, and maybe even if you've identified them too, that would be fantastic.